Right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let's get into it. My name is Matthew Bastos, and for today's presentation, I will be doing a critical evaluation of the global conspiracy theory of whether or not COVID-19 was an engineered biological weapon. Now, I'm sure everyone has had their own fair share uh, of experience when it comes to COVID-19, and it was something that we all collectively, even on a global scale, had to, I'll say, endure. And, I'm sure everyone has had their own perspective on the conspiracy theory. So I won't be coming from a personal point of view when it comes to this. This presentation is merely weighing both sides of the coin, essentially, and then coming to my own conclusion based upon factual evidence that's been provided in regards to this conspiracy theory. And let's dive into it. So, within this presentation, I've organized it into five key sections. So within the first one, we are going to do just some background information as to what COVID-19 essentially is, and also what bioweapons are and how they've been used historically. Then we're going to go into a deep dive analysis as to what the conspiracy theory is in itself, followed by the arguments that support it and also go against it. Finally, we are going to wrap it up with a personal analysis of the conspiracy theory and then conclude it with a final concluding thought. Sure, many of you, if there are many people listening to this, have had their own fair share of experience when it comes to COVID-19 and more than likely came to your own conclusion as to what you feel like it is. There is a lot of misinformation involved with this disease or virus, I should say. So what I'll do is explain essentially what COVID-19 is within this slide. So COVID-19 is an infectious viral respiratory illness, and this is actually caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. This was first detected in late 2009 within Wuhan, China itself, and it did lead to many unprecedented, I guess you could say, experiences on a global scale. The illness led to many deaths, unfortunately. Many people suffered, physical ailments. And then on top of that, we had to experience, social lockdowns and everything that came with that. This virus is something that is spread through essentially airborne droplets, and it does vary depending, like the severity depends on the case. Um, for example, there are individuals who were able to be asymptomatic but still carry the virus and pass it on to those who essentially were not. And in those cases, many people passed away, and it became very fatal cases for people. And this virus is also a part of a larger corona family virus, which also includes the SARS virus and the MERS virus. Right, so now let's answer the question as to what are biological weapons. So, biological weapons are deliberately created or essentially altered viruses, bacteria, or toxins that can be used to cause harm or to be used within a war itself. And within history, they have been used, unfortunately. Um, it goes back all the way into the medieval era when it comes to warfare and essentially different Cold War programs as well. And because of the danger of using biological weapons and the devastating impact that comes with using those type of weapons, they were banned under a global treaty in 1972. But unfortunately, with modern genetic tools, people worry they could be reintroduced in more subtle ways and quite possibly may have already been introduced in many different subtle ways. So, within the context of biological weapons, it's easy for one to associate that with the COVID-19 virus in itself. which is why it's led to be it being such a common conspiracy theory, even throughout the world. Everyone has their own perspective as to what COVID-19 was, and even while experiencing it, people had opposing thoughts, which, you know, it really did completely destroy certain people's dynamics, friendships, families. We won't get into that, but this is essentially what biological weapons are on a historical point of view. So the conspiracy theory does come with many claims, and the major focus was that the virus itself was created in a lab, it was manufactured. And this was stated to be manufactured specifically within the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I apologize. Um, and some people who support the conspiracy theory also claim to have the notion that there was a gain of function experiments that were taking place within that institute, which often enhance viral traits for research purposes, which honestly could be a possible contributor. The theory does suggest either an intentional release or an accidental one when it comes to the consequences that we faced. It's hard to tell. This was a very devastating virus that, you know, it really did show us its impact on a global scale. It was able to essentially shut down the world, so it's easy for one to pinpoint a, uh, a blame in a sense, where it's like, well, this is where it originated, this is where it started, or is it? And we're going to answer those questions in the slides to come. And now, just to kind of tie it back into the historical context, biological weapons is something that have long existed, and unfortunately, it is a part of our history that does fuel a lot of the suspicion when it comes to this conspiracy theory. Um, we can't deny that biological weapons have been used in our history. In our past, this is something that we have done, and it's left its imprint. It's left a scar, on many people's perspective when it comes to reality, and it helps to reinforce the ideologies when it comes to certain conspiracy theories. And what I will say is that when people learn about biological weapons and biological warfare, and how it often occurred within World War II, and that many governments around the world, not one in particular, but many governments did hide these experiments, it it kind of helps to apply a certain level of distrust within today, like within a scientific reason, I guess you could say, is that many people aren't going to trust what the science says because of the simple fact that this is something that has taken place already. So why isn't it going to take place again? Which brings into question whether or not this conspiracy theory is true. What I will say is that when you mix in delayed data sharing and certain different misinformation being presented on the internet, it does lay the groundwork for the conspiracy theory and for many other conspiracy theories when it comes to just perspectives and people giving their opinion and taking it as fact, and then having that be interpreted in many different ways because the information on the internet can be so misconstrued at times. Oh, now let's get into the evidence supporting the theory of whether or not COVID-19 was an engineered biological weapon. So many people do believe that the COVID-19 virus was created in a lab, and it is hard to ignore that point, being that the outbreak itself started in Wuhan, China, and that's exactly where the Wuhan Institute of Virology is based. That's one. The lab was actively also researching back coronaviruses, ironically, which feels a little more coincidental, but I don't want to throw my own personal perspective on that matter. But on top of that, they were doing, again, just to reference it, the gain of function experiments and research, which is essentially tweaking viruses to better understand how they spread. And these experiments that were conducted, as controversial as they were, many people argued that they posed a lot of safety risks and concerns, and they did. Now, when you combine that with how things were handled, especially within the early days of the outbreak, you had the Chinese authorities silence whistleblowers, and they also delayed releasing key information regarding the virus, which I feel like could have helped um, us better prepare for the impact it laid. And that kind of secrecy, it also helps to build a certain level of distrust within the public. Because if there's something that you're hiding, why, for one, are you hiding it? And for two, what is it that you're hiding? So again, this made people feel even more suspicious. And to add to that, there's the US Senate report from 2023, which said a lab-related incident was plausible. So, I mean, it doesn't necessarily confirm, but if even an official source is saying it's not off the table, then perhaps there's some truth there. And with all of this being said, the research, the timing, the censorship, sorry, and the report from the Senate, it all adds up to the theory, um, which has raised a lot of further follow-up valid questions in regards to, its origin and its purpose. Okay, so now that we have looked at the supporting information for the conspiracy theory, we're now going to take a look at the pushback from the scientific community because the evidence against the lab origin theory is actually pretty strong. So for starters, virologists, sorry, that word is difficult for me to even pronounce, have closely studied the genetic makeup of SARS-CoV-2, and they didn't actually find any signs of engineering. If the virus had been manipulated in a lab, there'd typically be some markers or indication within its genome showing where the changes were made, and those weren't actually displayed. And just to follow up with that, many experts point that if someone wanted to create a biological weapon like they've done so in the past, they'd more likely do it or design it to be more targeted and or controllable. And not essentially from my perspective, but just from the evidence that we've been shown from COVID-19, the behavior, including how it spread and how it mutated, it looked like something that was much more naturally evolving. And it turns out that there's historical precedent to that. Scientists have tracked how viruses like SARS and MERS jumped from animals to humans before, from a historical context. And even the global health organizations also gave their perspective and called the lab theory extremely unlikely after visiting Wuhan and reviewing the data. They did conclude that the virus probably came from wildlife and spread through the wet market, which fits in with the pattern we've seen with other outbreaks. So, while questions about the conspiracy theory and skepticism over it are valid, the genetic evidence and the analysis that came from the experts, scientifically speaking, lean heavily toward a natural origin when it comes to this virus. Great. So, now that we have covered both sides of the coin, I want to take a moment to kind of just zoom out in terms of perspective when it comes to this theory, because while the science said one thing, the political landscape had its own, essentially its own momentum. From an international perspective, the lab leak theory became more of a hot button issue, essentially in countries with a lot more tense relations with China. And there were many politicians which leaned into the idea a lot more aggressively, and it kind of framed the virus's origin as a matter of national security or political accountability. Um, there was a pretty big moment in the US government when they launched an investigation into the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And even though the scientific consensus pointed toward more of a natural origin, there were some agencies that left room for some alternative possibilities, which did add fuel to the debate. And then then there's the media influence. The news outlets, news reports across different countries around the world covered the story in a very intensified, dramatic, theatrical way, in my opinion. Um, and from what we've seen, not only a matter of my opinion, but from what we've seen, that's exactly essentially what happened. Um, and in some cases, headlines amplified unproven theories before facts were even verified or proven, which helped to shape the public perception on a global scale. Following that, I will say that China's response, they did come back pretty hard, calling the bioweapon theory misinformation, and they also accused certain governments of politicizing, is what I'll say, the pandemic, making it more of a political endeavor when it was as bad as it was. That made international collaboration on researching the origin much more complicated, to be honest, because many people's perspective on the matter was so conflicted. It was hard for, a lot of people to come together, to work together to kind of solve the issue for itself. So while the scientific evidence was largely consistent, the political and the diplomatic response wasn't essentially that. And that division did play a very huge part in how different populations around the world understood the origin story of COVID-19. So, just to recap on everything we've covered thus far, supporters of the theory point to the lab proximity, the risky research that was taking place, and the political secrecy. The scientific rebuttals tend to highlight natural evolution, lack of engineered signatures within the actual makeup of the virus, and better data supporting a market origin. So the evidence against the theory is stronger, but I will say that both sides do deserve ample amounts of scrutiny when it comes to outlining the truth of the matter and exactly taking fact for what it is and not necessarily imprinting it with our own perception of reality. Now, within my conclusion, after exploring, the different sub-theories within the theory in itself, the scientific evidence, and how politics and media have helped to shape the debate, this is essentially what I think. The lab leak theory, it did spark a lot of discussion, I will say that, especially politically, and the scientific community, it makes a strong case for a natural origin, I will say. But honestly, that's where a lot of the concrete evidence also points to, especially when you look at the virus's genetic structure and how similar outbreaks have happened like this before in our history. Um, so what I will also say, just to add to that, is also I think that the political and the media response to this virus did expose something that a little bit deeper is how quickly uncertainty can get weaponized or even distorted. And when information is incomplete, and then there's speculation that takes over, and once people form strong beliefs behind these speculations, it's very difficult to shift that narrative, I'll say, back to the facts, factual evidence. But ultimately, I believe it's essential to keep asking questions, but those questions should be rooted or guided by science, not necessarily by emotional response or geopolitical pressures. The origin of COVID-19 might still hold unanswered pieces, yes, but what's clear is the need for global cooperation, transparency, and the commitment to truth, regardless of how you perceive the truth. You need to commit yourself to seeing the factual evidence and taking it for what it is, even if it goes against what you believe it to be. And finally, just to kind of wrap it all up together, is it possible? Yes, technically. Is it probable though? Not based on the facts that we have been provided. Conspiracies can be very attractive when the truth kind of feels out of reach, but the real conclusion behind the matter does take a bit of work, it does take a bit of research. So what I will say is that even though it may seem to be true, sometimes you do have to do more of a deeper dive in order to find the actual truth for what it is. Thank you for listening.